Hey guys, Hamsterwheel here, and today I want to try something different. You see, the main character on everyone's classic account will probably enter TBC dungeons and raids with already some pretty nice gear. Whether it's blues and epics from TBC dungeons or the awesome Nax gear that you're probably gonna hold on to throughout your journey to TBC raids. That, and there's also a lot of talk about what class will do the most damage in their pre-raid gear. But what about the opposite side of the spectrum? What about your freshly dinked level 70 alt that doesn't have a boatload of gear yet? Or everyone who just got to level 70 on a TBC private server? I'm looking at you, people that play on Endless. Basically, which class is the least dependent on gear and will still be able to do solid DPS even in crappy gear? Well, today I wanted to find that out. So what I did was give a whole bunch of class and spec combinations a bunch of random gear. This time around I will not use my raid environment because, let's face it, characters with this type of gear will not raid to begin with under normal situations. So in this case I'll use a random mob without any crazy debuffs and also no consumables to kinda simulate you running a level 70 normal dungeon. I also went out of my way to make sure every class and spec combination has the same kind of gear level, so to say, to make sure that there are no unfair advantages when it comes to gear. Alright, so without further ado, let's put a bunch of class and spec combinations to the test and let's see who comes out on top. So let's start off with the Shaman. For the Shaman we're going to check out both DPS specs. Let's check out the Enhancement Shaman first, with their ability to dual wield and some pretty sweet totems that will boost their damage. So on average, our Enhancement Shaman is able to do a respectable 635.3 DPS, which is definitely not too shabby considering the crappy gear it's wearing. Then we're off to give Elemental a try. Now Elemental is often considered to be pretty strong DPS when it comes to low geared characters, so let's see if that's the case. And in this DPS test it churns out a very nice 770.5 DPS. Amazing for level 70 normal dungeons and still pretty adequate for level 70 heroic dungeons. Alright, moving on to the Mage, and for the Mage class I decided to go for Deep Fire and PvE Frost, as these are the two specs that give our Mage a good shot to do decent DPS even with this crappy gear. And we're starting off with Deep Fire, and in this spec we did a reasonable 719.9 DPS, beating the Enhancement Shaman but not the Elemental Shaman, which did about 50 DPS more. Up next is Full Frost for PvE, which is definitely not as popular as Fire, but it is considered to be pretty darn strong with low gear, so let's see if that's the case. And as it turns out, it's true, with a very impressive 972.8 DPS on average, which is pretty viable DPS even in tier 4 raids. Which is amazing considering the random crappy gear our mage is wearing, and it shows just how powerful Full Frost in PvE can be and how little gear and buffs you need to pump out proper DPS. Next up, the Druid. Now for the Druid I opted for both Feral DPS and Balance. First let's try out the Feral Druid. Now for the Feral Druid I did my best to use power shifting in the rotation, as that's a considerable DPS upgrade, and try my best to execute this properly, as I do have little experience with CAD DPS in the Burning Crusade. But even with my mediocre execution of it, I turned out a decent 533.2 DPS, which is okay in normal dungeons, but as of right now in this DPS test, the Feral Druid takes last place. Time to check out the Balanced Druid, and the Balanced Druid in this gear level turned out an adequate 568.0 DPS, which is a little better than the Feral Druid, but so far the Druid is at the bottom of the list with both specs. Which kinda makes sense, as Balanced Druids are more gear dependent than, let's say, a Frost Mage or Elemental Shaman, and a Feral Druid also shines when it has better gear, possibly the Wolf's Head helmet thrown in there, and admittedly someone who has more experience power shifting. Okay, time for the Warlock. Now the Warlock has a couple of specs that work decently well with crappy gear, which are Affliction, Demonology, and Fire Destruction. Shadow Destruction is probably the most popular one in TBC, but it needs a lot of gear before it becomes really good, so we're not using that one for now. First up, Affliction, a spec that is considered to be pretty strong early on, as it isn't as reliable on gear as some other specs. And it shows, because in this test, the Affliction Warlock did an average of 714.2 DPS, which is definitely not too bad. Up next is another spec which is considered to be pretty good even with low gear, and that is Demonology. There's multiple variations of this spec, but in this case I'm rolling with a Felguard. And well, I was quite shocked at the DPS this class and spec combination turned out. It did an amazing 1007.8 DPS. I'm not kidding, I didn't do anything crazy, and I checked afterwards to see if the DPS runs I did had a lot of lucky crits in them, but they didn't. The Demonology Warlock just turns out to be really damn strong even with crappy gear, and it takes the lead in this DPS test over the Frost Mage and has done quadruple digit DPS in a bunch of random crappy items. That's just amazing and a testament to how powerful Demonology Warlocks are in TBC. And then last but not least for the Warlock, we check out the Fire Destruction spec. With this spec, the Warlock once again shows an impressive number, with an average of 859 DPS. So there's a lot of talk about how Warlocks will be very powerful in TBC, and this test in crappy gear just shows how much they can do on their own without any outside help like totems, extra buffs or consumables, and it seems that regardless of the gear level, Warlocks can do really good damage in multiple specs. Then we move on to the Shadow Priest, a class and spec combination mostly known for the amazing buffs and utility they bring, but not known for topping the meters. Still though, let's see how well a Shadow Priest can perform in this situation when they have crappy gear and they don't have a ton of buffs and consumables. And well, the Shadow Priest turned out an average DPS of 658.7, which is not too bad and puts it give or take in the middle of the other contenders. And on its own, that 658.7 DPS is a pretty good number with this gear level, and it's definitely good enough for level 70 normal dungeons. So overall, the Shadow Priest didn't do too bad of a job. And then we check out another meme spec, so to say, the Retribution Paladin. Now while the Retribution Paladin does get a bunch of buffs and extra abilities like Crusader Strike, they're still considered to be not the greatest when it comes to DPS. So let's see what the Retribution Paladin can do in this type of gear. And in this case, the Paladin does an average of 491.5 DPS. Definitely not amazing, and it finds itself at the bottom of this DPS test, with the first character dipping below the 500 DPS line. Then again, it does make sense, since many melee classes rely heavily on gear and a Wind Fury totem in order to do good damage. And at this gear level, while providing adequate DPS for normal dungeons, it just doesn't match the superior DPS of other class and spec combinations we've seen so far. Time for some more melee classes, in this case the Fury Warrior, which is probably our best spec for now to give the Warrior the best shot at pulling decent DPS. And in this gear level, the Warrior did an average of 489.4 DPS. Not amazing, but then again, a Warrior is reliant on good gear and also a Wind Fury totem, and in this case, this test did not come with an execute phase, so if it did, the DPS would probably be higher. Still though, it's quite evident that at this gear level, the Warrior probably can't match the Warlock or Frost Mage, even if it did have an execute phase or a Shaman with Wind Fury totem to back it up. Alright, time for the Rogue class, and in TBC, at least with crappy gear, the Combat Sword Spec Rogue is our best shot for this DPS test, so for now we're only checking out that one. And in this gear, the Rogue did an average of 514.8 DPS. Definitely not amazing, and it puts the Rogue at the bottom of the DPS list, though at least it is beating out the Warrior and the Paladin in this test. And it goes without saying that just like the Warrior and Paladin, the Rogue would benefit a lot more from higher gear and the addition of extra buffs like a Wind Fury totem. And last but definitely not least, the Beast Mastery Hunter, considered to be a very good spec regardless of your gear level. And I also decided to go with this spec since the other ones are not as good in terms of raw DPS, as marksmanship can't quite match Beast Mastery and survival is more of a support spec. And in this gear, the Beast Mastery Hunter churns out an impressive 779.8 DPS overall, placing it pretty high in our DPS test, but it doesn't beat out the Warlock or the Frost Mage. But in a situation where the Hunter has, let's say, a Warrior tank and maybe some other class in its party that drastically decreases the armor of the boss, it could probably do 800 plus DPS with ease. For now though, 779.8 is our number for today. And that concludes our DPS test in crappy gear. Our top 5 is as following. Number 5 is the Elemental Shaman with 770.5 DPS. Number 4, the Beast Mastery Hunter with 779.8 DPS. Number 3, the Fire Destruction Warlock with 859 DPS. Number 2, the Frost Mage with 972.8 DPS. And our winner of this test, the Demonology Warlock with a very impressive 1007.8 DPS. And in this graph you can see how all the class and spec combinations are stacked up against each other. As you can see, there's a big difference between the last place and first place, with our Demonology Warlock doing more than double the DPS of both the Fury Warrior and Retribution Paladin. Of course, I'd like to remind you guys one more time to take this test with a grain of salt, as the setup in your party when running a dungeon can differ vastly. Sometimes you're lucky and as a rogue you get to team up with a shaman and thus get Wind Fury. Sometimes as a mage you're lucky and you find the other two DPSers to be an Elemental Shaman and Boomkin, which will drastically increase your DPS too. And sometimes you get unlucky with the group setup and only get a basic set of buffs like Arcane Intellect, Mark of the Wild or something similar. For now though, it is evident which class and spec combination rely very little on gear and which are very dependent on it to do decent DPS. And in this test it were the Warlock, Frost Mage, Beast Mastery Hunter and Elemental Shaman that shined the most. And that's gonna do it for now. As always, I want to thank you for watching this video. I'm Hamsterwheel and have a good one.